prowled across the shores of Canton as thousands of wooden crates were stacked high, towering over the Chinese soldiers. Inside them, opium, enough to poison an empire. A single command broke the silence. Burn it all! Torches were thrown. Flames erupted. The air filled with thick, acrid smoke as millions of dollars worth of opium went up in flames. But across the ocean, Britain was watching, and they would not let this go unanswered. This wasn't just trade. This was war. To understand how it all began, we have to go back. The early 1800s. China was untouchable, the world's richest and most advanced civilization. It had tea, silk, and porcelain, goods that Britain craved. But there was a problem. China didn't need anything from Britain. It had its own wealth, its own resources. Trade was one-sided. Chinese goods flowed into Britain, but British silver poured out in return. The British Empire was bleeding money, and then they found a solution: opium. Britain began smuggling opium into China, introducing millions to the highly addictive drug. At first, it was discreet: a few smugglers, a handful of corrupt officials. Then it became an epidemic. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted. Farmers, merchants, even government officials. Entire villages collapsed under its grip. China's economy was crumbling. Families sold everything for another hit. Soldiers were too weak to fight. The Qing emperor saw his empire rotting from the inside, and he had one choice: fight back. Enter Lin Zexu, a man with a mission. A high-ranking Chinese official, Lin saw opium for what it was: a weapon of war disguised as trade. He made a decision that would change history. Seize the opium, destroy it all. Show Britain that China would not be broken. In 1839, under Lin's orders, Chinese forces raided British warehouses, confiscating over 20,000 chests of opium, worth millions. But it wasn't enough to just seize it. Lin wanted to send a message. All of it would be burned. On June 3, 1839, before the eyes of the world, the Chinese dumped thousands of crates of opium into the Pearl River, the dark waters swallowing Britain's most valuable commodity. Soldiers poured chemicals over the remaining stockpiles, igniting massive bonfires. The air thickened with acrid smoke. The stench of burning opium choked the streets of Canton. For Lin, it was a victory. For Britain, it was an insult. This wasn't just an attack on their opium. It was an attack on their power, their wealth, and their empire. And so they responded the only way empires do: with war, gunboats, cannons, soldiers. In the months that followed, British warships sailed toward China's shores. The Chinese had numbers, thousands of men, legions of soldiers trained in traditional warfare. But Britain had technology. The Chinese Navy, armed with wooden ships and outdated cannons, stood no chance against Britain's steam-powered warships lined with iron hulls and advanced artillery. The first battles were massacres. Chinese forces collapsed under the sheer power of British power. Towns were burned, ports seized, entire regiments wiped out in hours. This wasn't war. This was a slaughter. And as British soldiers marched inland, China, a civilization that had stood for thousands of years, began to crumble. The war was over before it even began. China had numbers. Britain had firepower. Chinese junks, wooden ships armed with outdated cannons, were no match for British warships, lined with iron and bristling with heavy guns. Britain's forces swept through China's coastal cities, cutting off supplies and forcing the Qing dynasty to its knees. After just 3 years, China surrendered. The Treaty of Nanjing, 1842. A single document that humiliated an empire. China was forced to open its ports to British merchants. Britain took Hong Kong, an island that would remain under British control for over 150 years. Opium trade? It wasn't stopped. It was legalized. But Britain wasn't finished. 15 years later, they came back, this time with France as an ally. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, was even more brutal. British and French forces marched into Beijing, looting and burning the Imperial Summer Palace, one of China's greatest treasures. The message was clear: China would never resist Britain again. The Qing dynasty, once powerful, now stood fractured, bleeding, and humiliated. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The Opium Wars weren't just wars over drugs. They were wars over control, and China had lost. Over the next few decades, foreign powers carved up China, taking control of ports and trade. Britain, France, Russia, Japan, each took their share. The once mighty empire became a playground for foreign nations. But something was happening beneath the surface. The people were angry, humiliated. They saw their leaders as weak, corrupt, and unable to defend their land. This rage would boil over into rebellions, some of the bloodiest uprisings in history. It would take decades of war, resistance, and revolution. But eventually, in 1911, the Qing dynasty would fall. And the modern era of China, shaped by opium, war, and resistance, had begun. The Opium Wars were not just about drugs. They were about power, greed, and the brutal reality of empire. A single product, opium, changed the fate of an entire civilization. Millions suffered, a dynasty fell, and a new China began to rise. But even today, the scars remain. Hong Kong, taken in war, was only returned to China in 1997. The anger, the humiliation, it never truly faded. What do you think? Was this just trade or one of history's greatest crimes? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more dark, untold stories from history, subscribe and hit the like button, because the past is filled with shadows, and we're just getting started.